how do you now do the research to understand what is the ruling in this thing that is not explicitly mentioned? And they can not only answer based off the question that's being provided to them, but then what's important is they also know what the questioner needs to provide that they haven't provided. Right? We get a question from the UK, say, we've got this ikhtilaf in like Isha time, like when do we pray Isha? We say, ask your local ulama. Like there's ikhtilaf there, there's circumstances there. The other thing then is if somebody does want to go overseas, what they should also look for is that ensure that the teacher also has exposure to different cultures so that the teacher can also train the student accordingly.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is your host, Mufti Sahab with Project Ihya, along with Mufti Tufail. Today we have a very honorable and special guest with us. Welcome, Mufti Abrar Mirza.
Jazakumullah khairan for having me.
Jazakumullah khairan for being on. For over 1,000 years, the Madhāhib have been central to the lives of Muslims as a systematic way of getting legal verdicts. Muftis have been trained based on the principles and rulings of these schools. However, there are many common questions that students of knowledge who are not trained or active in the field of Ifta have. Today, we will seek to deepen our understanding on key points regarding the inner mechanisms of the Madhāhib, as well as how Fatwa is given according to the Hanafi madhab. MashaAllah, Mufti Abrar is a very respected scholar in North America. He has trained in the Hanafi madhab under the tutelage of the well-known Mufti Ibrahim Desai, who founded AskImam.org. Mufti Abrar went on to found Darul Ifta Chicago, where he trains ulama in the field of issuing legal verdicts. He's an expert in the Hanafi madhab, and today we will be presenting some technical questions to him about the madhahib and specifically usul al-ifta. And I turn it over to Mufti Tufail now.
So just to get started, inshallah, Mufti Sahab, what are your thoughts on, why are madhahib needed? Why can't if a person claims that they're following the Quran and Sunnah, then is that something that they can do directly? If not, then what would be the problem with that? Would you shed some light on this?
Sure. So I think this question itself is a quite lengthy one. We recently had Mufti Sahab. He was visiting and he visited the madrasa, and we had him do like a rapid fire Q&A session with the crowd. So he was giving like 1 word, 2 word, like quick 5-10 second answers to the questions. And then for this one, he spent like 45 minutes. So I think it's like what I can say, like just to be quite succinct on it. And then, I think like an entire podcast that's dedicated to this topic of like, what are madhahib like, and, how they develop and like the need to follow them and such, I think is probably a good idea itself. But just to kind of give a more succinct answer, what I would say is if you look at hadith sciences, right, there's a science to hadith that was established, was codified, and it's followed. What you can think of the madhahib is somewhat similar, right? It's a codification of certain principles that help you derive rulings to issues. There's a history of kind of how they developed and such, which perhaps maybe is beyond the scope of the discussion today. But there are a set of principles, the madhahib are a set of principles that help you extract rulings, because not every answer necessarily is explicitly stated in the Quran, is not explicitly stated in the Sunnah, but you have certain principles you can derive from what is in the Quran, what is in the Sunnah, and those principles then will help you get to rulings, right? We know that our deen is until the end of times, and there's going to be not just tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, but millions of issues are going to come over that span of time. And not every single one of those things is going to be an explicit hadith necessarily behind it. But you're going to have principles that will always help you to come to what the answer there should be. The madhahib are the codification of those principles that help you derive what those rulings are. And there isn't just one set of principles. There's, the mujtahideen have derived a certain set of principles, and they had, there's a ijtihadi difference in terms of what those set of principles are, and that's how you have the different madhahib. They're a collection and a coherent set of principles.
Those principles are also taken from the Quran and Sunnah as well, right?
Everything is taken from the Quran and Sunnah. Those principles are from the Quran and Sunnah, and then those principles will help you. So someone who's trying to find an answer to a contemporary issue today, or even those fuqaha who came before us had these set of principles that would derive from the Quran and Sunnah that made it easier for those who came thereafter to derive the end, get to the end ruling. So we say that whatever set of principles a person is following, they can follow those, but because it's a set of principles, it doesn't work when you start to mix principles. And maybe this is something that we can talk about a bit separately as well. But just in a high level, that's sort of what the madhahib are.
I think in that perspective, we can also say that like everyone in that sense is following a madhab. Even a person who claims not to follow a madhab, in essence, they're just following a fifth madhab, right? Like, because if you ask that person that, for example, why do you recite Subhana Rabbiyal Azim in ruku'? It's not that they have it, off the top of their head that, this is taken from this hadith and so forth. Rather, they're also following somebody's, methodological structure, whether it's, some scholar of recent times or whether it's someone of old times.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a sense, to your point, you can say someone's following someone, right? You're following some ruling of a prior mujtahid, whoever that may be, or prior scholar whoever that may be. But because we define and we're looking at madhahib as like a coherent set of principles, what you have when someone doesn't follow any of those madhahib is you have individual collection of rulings, not a coherent set of principles that go behind them. So that's where I would kind of make a nuance to say maybe I wouldn't call it a madhab. Sure, you're following rulings, but it's not really a madhab without a coherent set of principles. So
we can say they're doing taqleed, but not in a proper structure, so it wouldn't even qualify as a madhab.
Yeah, I mean, if someone says, I always take whatever ruling these set of 3-4 ulama mention, then yes, they're following those ulama, but it doesn't create a madhab though.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say about if you have the average person today, let's say in America or anywhere else really, even in in other countries as well, the person does not go directly to the books of the madhab, like they do not address the books of fiqh within the Hanafi madhab or within the Shafi'i school, within the Maliki or the Hanbali school. Rather, they'll go to their local imam or their local mufti and they'll ask that person. So in essence, are they truly a muqallid of the school itself, or would you say that they're doing taqleed of their local mufti?
Yeah, and I think you're kind of getting into this discussion of like the amila madhab lahu, I guess, right? So the responsibility of a person, right? The base, most essential responsibility of a person is فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ, right? You have to ask the people of remembrance if you don't know. So that person's responsibility is, at minimum, you have to go and seek the answer from someone. Now, if that means you have access to your local imam because that's that's who you go to for your questions, then that's fine. They can go and just they ask and then they get their answers from that scholar. And for that person, at the most foundational level, that may be sufficient, right? Where you have now asked the people, you've identified a scholar, you've asked him, the accountability has shifted now, where you fulfilled your part of asking someone, and now the accountability has shifted to the scholar, where it is now their job to provide a proper and accurate answer.
So Mufti Sahab, that means that the only people who are liable of being madhab aware would be the ulama. Is that the case?
I wouldn't say that because, there's like a very foundational base thing, which is, look, if you don't know anything, just ask someone and follow what they tell you. But a person can't be, can't suffice themselves or can't be acceptable of like that base foundation, right? A person has to make an effort to understand what are the rulings of salah, what are the rulings of zakat, what are the rulings of nikah, what are the rulings of different aspects of their life. Like, they have to make an effort to learn. But if one issue kind of comes up, or like before they get to those learnings, someone who's just starting off on their journey, like they're going to have individual questions, but the person can't stay there, right? That's just a starting point. Eventually, they need to understand the broader rulings.
And one follow-up question here is like, for example, like when someone goes to a doctor, right? Like he has a medical issue. So he's going to, his responsibility is to ask a doctor, but there is a baseline, right? The baseline is, for example, someone has graduated from medical college and they've passed their residency and so on and so forth. So in this, a common person would be, he's aware of this, right? But for example, a person who goes to the masjid, he just sees someone with a beard, a sheikh, and then that person may not even be trained, and he doesn't have that baseline, or even what is that baseline? Should there be a baseline, right? Or is it enough, for example, he just goes to the local imam of the masjid who kind of answers him, even though he knows he's not very well trained?
Now, our ulama have mentioned that there are certain responsibilities of the mufti, and then there are certain responsibilities of the mustafti, the one who's seeking a fatwa. And it is, Mufti Sahab mentions this in his Usul Ifta wa Adabuhu as well, and others have mentioned it, that it is wajib on the mustafti that to the best of their extent, they ensure that the person that they're asking is qualified to give the answer to that question. That is a responsibility on the questioner, on the mustafti. So they can't just simply say, well, he leads the salat by masjid, or he's got a beard, or he wears a turban or such. They have to make an effort to ensure that within the type of question that I'm asking, that this person is qualified to give an answer to that.
So if you had, let's say, a revert, right, like somebody who just accepted Islam, what would you recommend to them? Like, what would your guidelines be to them that this is what you should look in a person that you're asking a question? This is a person that qualifies as a mufti. This is the role that they play in Western countries or even in non-Western countries, and so forth. What would your recommendation be to that revert?
I mean, I think for something like that, you would say, look, if you've got questions on making sure like you're up and running in terms of like, your basic ahkam of like tahara and salah and such, like any scholar who has been through a rigorous system of learning should be able to give you those foundations, right? Now, if you have some contemporary issue that isn't well known amongst the ulama necessarily, requires research, requires a ruling, then say yes, then you go and you speak to people that are muftis or have like gone through a process where they've learned how to issue fatawa and such. But for if you want to learn about your tahara and your Sawm, zakat, hajj, your ibadat, your basic foundations, then we say, look, go learn with your imam, go learn with your local folks, and you start from there. Right?
So the analogy maybe that we can make is something like you have the general practitioner. So like, if you have some kind of, basic question, then ask that general practitioner. But if you have something that's more specialized, then you go to the specialist.
Yeah, and what I say is it's also a responsibility of those general practitioners, like your general ulama, to know what is the scope of services they can offer, and what are the scope of services that are meant to be referred to as specialist. Right?
And
yeah, I mean, I definitely find that like in most masajid or centers that we have like in North America, the role of the imam is kind of like the qadi, mufti, imam, muallim, mudarris, muhaddith, right? Like all of it together. So I think a lot of things get jumbled up in that. But I think the point that you mentioned is a really good one, that the local imam or whoever it is also their job to find the specialist in the field and then refer to them, just like any GP would do.
One question I have here is, Mufti Sahab, like, what exactly is a mufti, right? Like a lot of people, for them, it's just they see, okay, there's a 7-year course, right? And this is for the Indian subcontinent context. They see there's a 7-year course and then +1 or +2 years, and the person becomes mufti. What happens in that Iftā course that makes them different, right? From what what an alim studied.
Yeah, I think when we talk about like what is a mufti or who is a mufti, I think you have to first start with, well, basically, what is a fatwa, right? And a fatwa linguistically is just an answer to a question, and legally though it is an answer to a juridical, a fiqhi matter, like it pertains to ahkam shari'a amaliya, like your practical actionable matters of the deen. And the mufti is then someone who is qualified to provide answers on those ahkam shari'iyya amaliya. And the qualification is that this is a person who has then built a fiqhi mizaj, they've built like a fiqhi mindset, and they've developed that through mulazamatul faqih, meaning like you've spent a lot of time with someone who themselves have that sort of a mindset, and you've done extensive tamreen and practice under their supervision. Okay? And then this is something that a person makes an effort, and then it's also tawfiqi that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has to grant somebody that sort of a mindset. It's not, it's not just you do a course and you finish a certain number of credits, books, pass an exam, right? That mindset has to be built, and it has to be built under prolonged supervision. Yes, you have a course where you put together and, teach them certain books and do a full-time training, but then it has to continue thereafter over time as well.
So one question here is like, for example, in alim course, ulama are studying many different books of fiqh, right? So why is, somebody may ask, why is that not enough, right? Why is not studying hidayah enough? And is there a distinction between fiqh and ifta, right? That is being made.
Yeah. So when a person studies fiqh within their alim course, right, they're understanding the rules, they're understanding some of the logic behind those rules. They study usul fiqh, and just how do you, like, what are the principles of how the rulings came about from the Quran and the Sunnah and so on. They study a lot of different fields, and you get a good understanding in some of your foundational fiqh rulings. And then ifta is then basically, okay, now when you get questions, right, how do you properly answer them, find the reference, break down the question, understand like how does it work, right? The mufti's job is to convey what they believe to the best of their abilities is the hukm of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a particular matter. Okay? And that's why our ulama have mentioned that person is somebody who does tawqi anillah, he signs on behalf of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? And in terms of like talk about like what is a mufti, kind of going back to that, like from just a linguistic perspective, like Allah subhanahu mentions yastaftuna qulillahu yuftikum, right? They seek fatwa from you, Allah will give you the fatwa. Right, so from like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from the Sharia, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself, there's an aspect of people asking about rulings, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala providing that rulings. And then fiqh sort of developed over time, and now the present day muftis, what they do is then they look to say, okay, what are the established rulings? Okay, what are these rulings that we have studied, in the different books of alim course, we know what those rulings are. When you get a question sometimes and the answer is quite easy, someone says, does this break my salat? The ruling's already there. You just have to provide the ruling. In other cases, there's a lot of contemporary issues. There's practical matters where you have to say, okay, how do you now do the research to understand what is the ruling in this thing that is not explicitly mentioned? Also, having an understanding, going deeper and in more depth to understand that these certain rulings, what were they based off of? Like, for example, are certain things based off of existing norms that now when the norms have changed, or if they're based on medical understanding, now the medical understanding has changed, like that sort of depth is necessary as well. Right? And it's always going to be like a subset of people, right? Like through nas, we know it's going to be a subset of people. Like ما كان المؤمن لينفر كافة ولولا نفر من كل فرقة منهم طائفة ليتفقهوا في الدين. Allah talks about a subset of people whose job will be to go have tafaqquh and go get that depth in fiqh, so that they can inform others. And it's the job of the muftis then to go into that additional depth. And some answers are, like you mentioned, like they're in hidayah, they're in quduri, they're in, like in your books, they're straightforward. And others require proper research. And the mufti's job then is to understand the question, what details are in the question, what details are missing in the question, what are the base concepts that you have to break the question out into, right? What is called as the takif of the of the matter? Like what is the Mufti Sahab mentions this as well. Like the mufti first has to do ijtihad and understand like what are the relevant things that even require the research, and then you do research in those matters, and then you put that together and you come up with the ruling, and then there's a way of kind of how you formulate and write and draft those rulings as well. So that is kind of the the specialization, if you will, beyond sort of the essential core foundational studies that everyone does in Alim course.
So just for the layperson, we know that part of the training of a mufti, basically almost across the board, will find that there's number one, beyond the general curriculum that alim would be studying, there's a component of usul al-ifta, that they're learning basically what the principles are of writing a fatwa, and that includes things like, tarjih, what opinion within the school will gain preference over another, what would be the Mufta Bihi, how do you assess things like necessity, darura, haja, right, dire need, and so on and so forth. So you go over these kind of issues over something like usul al-ifta, the different typologies of the fuqaha, the jurists within the schools, and so forth. And then there's also a component of qawaid fiqhiyya, like legal maxims that are derived from the Quran and Sunnah, as you mentioned before, and they can be generalized to newer cases. Mufti Sahab, what would be your let's say ideal curriculum in terms of a kind of a training process for a mufti? Do you think there are things that should be added beyond these kind of the two general aspects that we can find almost across the board in almost any Darul Ifta that provides that kind of training? Do you think there's something added? What would be interesting things, like should we incorporate Islamic finance, bioethics, and so on and so forth? What is your thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, any Iftā course should include the relevant content to ensure that the muftis that they train at the Darul Iftā can effectively serve the community. Right? So yes, you have your foundational usul al-Ifta type of content that you talked about that should be taught in any course, and you say, okay, within our community, within our country, within the challenges that we face, like how do we equip the student to be most effective? So yes, Islamic finance is a huge component within this, given that it is such a big need here, and then there's a dearth of ulama who can actually serve this need. That is something that any Iftā program here should definitely invest in and ensure that their students are strong within that. At the Darul Iftā, where I teach, we have experts from various fields come in and speak to the students to ensure that they get depth in various fields from the expert practitioners within those fields themselves. Right? So whether they're lawyers speaking about, how like civil divorce and some of these matters work, or how inheritance works. We have doctors, or we have like food scientists and chemists speaking about like how ingredients and like the change process that happens in istihala, like changing of processes in the process of like cooking or making different food items, like, or whether it's accountants explaining how like filings work, and like we make sure that we get these experts within the fields who are practicing to come in and provide some more of that depth to the students, so that when the students go out, they have beyond just a surface level understanding of these things, that they have a deeper understanding of how all these things work, and then it enables them to serve in a more effective manner. They can connect with the mustafti, the person asking the question, in a better manner, because they already understand where they're coming from, and they can not only answer based off the question that's being provided to them, but then what's important is they also know what the questioner needs to provide that they haven't provided. Right? So that's something that we are mindful of, and I would assume that anybody who's teaching Islamic would be mindful of that.
This is really interesting. I mean, do you guys do it like generic for everybody? Because I remember like when I had certain istifta that came related to like medical issues. I remember there was one case of like abortion because of the fetus having LBW complex. We basically worked with doctors to basically our findings in the medical aspect, that they confirm and like correct anything if need be. And then I remember I had a question related to tax returns, and is that jais to take, especially on zakah, because would that be like ujra ala ta'a or not? Like, would that be compensation on something that is already followed or not? And I had to consult with like a CPA to understand the actual taxation process. Like, is it something that is being given back that was already ours, or is it something that basically we're getting paid for doing? So do you have that as a generic training for everybody, or is it something that basically is only per need?
No, I think I think we should look at it in two levels. One is that we provide basic training to all of our students so that they have, a good understanding in all these different areas. But then separately, as needed, then where you need to consult and validate with some of the experts, then we'll do that as well, right? So, like for example, when I just give you a personal example, like when I was working on the one of the American Fiqh Academy resolutions that we worked on was, regarding these gender change surgeries and procedures, and beyond just kind of a general understanding of how those processes work and such, like we actually spoke to people, doctors who administer those hormones to such people, like Muslim doctors, in fact, who administer hormones to such people, to then get validation to our understanding and see like what additional incremental information we can also get from them. And we've done this, in most, I would say most of the resolution that we have ever issued through the American Fiqh Academy, we've always gone back and said, here is now our understanding. And we're able to do a certain amount of research because we have now, alhamdulillah, like some of that training. But as a safeguard, like we're always going to go back and just say, hey, like, can you because I mean the same thing, like when most of the people that we're speaking to, the experts in these fields, are not ulama, right? So we have to have the burden on us to ensure we're asking the right questions and challenging the right points, because they don't understand what will affect a ruling at the end of the day. So without us having some amount of depth, you won't be able to get the full set of information, right?
Now, I was saying it's kind of like a business analyst, like you're trying to you have to know which questions to ask. And one question I had is, I think you made the distinction between like, okay, what questions, like implicitly what questions we can ask an alim, someone who finished the initial course, and then versus what you can ask a mufti. I think that distinction is kind of clear. Is there a difference between asking a mufti personally on WhatsApp? You just message him a question and he gives you an answer, versus submitting a written question and getting a written answer. Because a lot of times people equate, I asked a mufti and this is the fatwa. Can you, and I have a follow-up question to this as well.
Sure. I mean, look, a proper fatwa is like given formally in writing, and in particular, there's like a style and a way that you're presented and such. Most people, don't necessarily request fatwas in that formal manner. They'll just WhatsApp, they'll quickly call, they'll catch you as you're exiting the masjid. And the reality is that, because, as Musa mentioned earlier, the mufti in the community is also the imam, is also the maktab teacher, the hifz teacher, the counselor, and all these other roles. The mufti isn't the person who's dedicated to sitting in a Darul Ifta and focusing on these efforts. The practicality of matters is that they also have limited time. So when they're asked a question in passing, when they're asked a question like on WhatsApp and such, they'll often just respond in a quicker, less formal manner as well. At the end of the day, the person who's asking a ruling wants to know like what is the ruling in this matter, and the mufti who's responding is telling them this is the ruling in the matter. Right now, whether you did it in a formal manner or you did it in an informal manner, at the end, like they still have the accountability of ensuring that you have to give the right answer that you are sure of, right? But yes, like there's a certain level of formality, not just formality, but a certain level of like strength that comes when you're able to do it in a proper manner, where you write out your question, you write out your proofs, and so on. And generally for questions that require more research, that's how it would be done. For questions that are more straightforward, they don't require as much research, or they're questions that the mufti has already answered in the past, they may just kind of do a quicker response as well. Sometimes I'll get questions where I'll just say, can you please send this to me in an email, because then that way like I do need to research it or have one of my students research it. And then in most of their cases, they ask, you respond in a more informal, quicker manner.
So my follow-up to this is, one of the purposes, if I understand correctly, of one of the main purposes of a madhab is to easily be able to get a legal verdict. So you have, like, you go to a mufti who's trained in that madhab, and he has a process that he follows, right? The usul al-ifta, and the output of that, right? There's a bunch of input, and the output is one final ruling that you get, right? And that comes out as the Mufta Bihi opinion. First, of course, I'd like, if there's a khalal in my understanding in that, please feel free to mention that. But my question is that, is there, like, the Mufta Bihi, first of all, what is it, and did I frame it correctly? And second of all, is there always only one Mufta Bihi opinion? In general, I guess, like the hukum. I know, like, with different mustaftis, you can have different ahkam based on situations, but for a general hukum, like, is there, like, only one?
Yeah, and I think maybe just to make sure, like, we don't get confused or hung up on terminology and technicalities, I think it's good to just kind of make a distinction first. So within the madhab, due to academic strength, one opinion may be what we call rajih, is dominant. Okay? And that can be conveyed, like the fuqaha may convey that this opinion is the dominant one based off of academic strength, and they will use either just the word of this is rajih, this is dominant, or they may use other words of like sihha, like this is sahih, this is asah and such, or they may use words of fatwa, like that the fatwa is on this view. Okay? And then at times, due to other factors beyond just academic strength and dalil and such, you have like difficulties in, haraj, changing of circumstances, and the fuqaha may give fatwa on an opinion, even if it's perhaps not the strongest view in terms of academic strength. Okay? So I'll give you an example where, Imam Abu Hanifa and his two main students, Imam Abu Yusuf, Imam Muhammad, collectively the two students referred to as sahibain, the two companions, disagreed on what is the duration for what is called the khiyar shat, the essentially return policy, the return policy window. Okay? And Imam Abu Hanifa said that it was 3 days, and his student said it is whatever is mutually agreed upon between the buyer and the seller. The dominant view in the madhab is Imam Abu Hanifa's view. So based off of academic strength itself, the dominant view in the madhab is Imam Abu Hanifa's opinion. That will always remain as the rajih view in the madhab. That will always be, because you can't have the strength of the dalil change over time. Right? That is always the dominant view in the madhab. Now, acknowledging that is a dominant view in the madhab, we have principles like those usul of ifta that allow us to give fatwa on sahibain's opinion, because you can imagine a Muslim business can't like effectively compete if they only have a 72-hour return policy, right? So there are certain principles that will allow us to say, okay, we will give fatwa on sahibain's opinion. It doesn't change the academic strength of a view itself. So we won't say from here on forth the dominant view within the Hanafi madhab is sahibain's opinion. The dominant view within the madhab will continue to remain Abu Hanifa's opinion. We may now give fatwa on sahibain's view for these other reasons. So, this type of, so to your question, the dominant view will remain sort of the dominant view. What the muftis give fatwa on, factoring in circumstances, urf, like norms and customs, difficulties of like haraj and like umum al-balwa and so on, that can lead them to give a fatwa other than what is the technically dominant view within the madhab. And those factors can vary from time to time. They can vary from country to country. Okay? But that's not based on the underlying strength of the dalil itself. It's other factors that pertain to its application.
So from this dichotomy that you've made, like these two categories of rulings, one is, you can say, particular to the person's situation or the condition during which the mufti is answering, and the other one is basically the dominant view within the madhab. What would you say that, especially for students of knowledge, when they see, for example, Ibn al-Humam, or if they see like Allama Anwar Shah Kashmiri and so on and so forth, like academics or like giants of the madhab that, let's say, go against something that is rajih within the madhab, for a student of knowledge, how should they process that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we have to understand is we as Hanafis, right, or those as Malikis or any other madhabs, we follow the madhab. Okay, we don't follow individuals, right? Those individuals meaning not just contemporary or even some of the individual fuqaha, like not even Imam Abu Hanifa, right? Like we follow the madhab, and many times within the madhab, the dominant view isn't even Imam Abu Hanifa's opinion, right? So when we follow a madhab, we're not following any person individually. We're following that codification of law, those principles, those laws that have been derived therefrom, and the view that basically, that view having been looked at and reviewed and affirmed by multiple mujtahideen in several generations. Now, within that, can you have certain ulama who, in their personal capacity, said that their own academics lead them to a certain different opinion? It's possible. It does happen, and it has happened. We don't deny that. Does that make it the view within the madhab? No. Does it change the dominant view of the madhab? It doesn't. Does it mean that you can give fatwa on their individual view? No. We acknowledge and say this learned person had this view in this matter, but that was their tafarrud, it's their personal view. The madhab remains the madhab.
Okay. So considering that, I mean, there's one point that you mentioned about that we don't follow any particular individual, rather the school itself. Let's say the amalgamation of the work of the different fuqaha, the different jurists within the school. Would you say then that taqlid shakhsi is not something that exists? Rather, it's basically there's taqlid, there's following of the madhab, but not really any particular person. What would be your comments towards someone like Sheikh Masa'id Baktash, who's written extensively on following particularly Imam Hanifa, and also I think Ibn Abidin also gives some workarounds to see how even following any of the fuqaha later, any of the jurists later, is essentially following Imam Abu Hanifa anyway. So what are your thoughts on taqlid shakhsi, or is there some? Me personally, I definitely sympathize and I agree with, I've always actually had the idea that we don't follow any particular, I think this is what makes madhahib strong actually. This is what makes it different than let's say somebody who doesn't follow a madhab, is that we have basically 1,000 years of thinking and legal reasoning that accumulates to this one answer that we have. It's a lot richer than somebody who just goes off on a tangent and passes a ruling on one thing. But what would be your response to taqlid shakhsi?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just want to make sure, like, again, that we don't with terminology, just making sure like people don't use them in different ways and have a different understanding. What we would say is, while we say we don't follow individuals, right? And we say we follow the madhab, like when a person is following the Hanafi madhab, like that taqleed is what we'd say a person should do, not that person says, I will follow whatever the Madhaahib say, right? And I'll pick from one of the madhabs. We say, look, you follow a particular madhab.
Mm-hmm.
And that taqleed is what we advocate, and there's different sort of reasons for that. But that to say like we follow a particular madhab is not like we can say we don't follow any specific individual and we follow the madhab, and that's not necessarily going against taqleed shakhsi. Like we are saying we do follow the Hanafi madhab and we stick to the Hanafi madhab, as opposed to saying if it's in any other madhahib we will go by it, but we won't go outside the madhahib, right? So that is what our ulama advocate as well. They say that you should stick to a madhab, and not that you say I will follow whatever is in any of the madhahib.
Right. I was thinking more like for students of knowledge, just like a particular case of sometimes students of knowledge have this question that, like, if you're following Imam Abu Yusuf and Imam Muhammad in certain masail, then how is that taqlid shakhsi? How is that following one person? Ibn Abidin gives certain answers to this, but generally the way I address it is that we don't necessarily follow just one individual. It's rather the principles that were built by certain individuals, the entire school. It's an entire process itself, right? It's not just 1, 2, 3 people. It's hundreds of people. But what would you say? It seems to me like what you're saying is that there's taqlid shakhsi, and following a madhab is kind of the same thing as doing taqlid shakhsi. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're asking is, within the madhab, can we then pick different rulings, right? like even if you say, okay, fine, I follow the Hanafi madhab, but then in the Hanafi madhab, like whatever opinion exists in the madhab, like I'll take whatever view I want within that. And I think that we say that no, like you have an ikhtilaf within the madhab between Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Muhammad, Imam Abu Yusuf, whoever. That ikhtilaf could be one of two types, right? Either it's an ikhtilaf of what is, asah and sahih, what is, two correct opinions, but one we say is, seems even stronger than the other, but they're both correct. And in that case, then it's better to go with the asah, but the sahih opinion is also fine. The other, and which is probably the majority of any difference you find, are more of what is the rajih view, what is the dominant view. And in that case, then we will always follow what is the dominant view. And this is what Ibn Abdin, rahimahullah, even in his Nazm, he starts with this point and he kind of ends with this point as well, right? That i'lam bi anna al-wajib ittiba'u ma tarjihu an ahlihi qad ulima, like know that the wajib is following that which its dominance has been established from those who are qualified to say what is the dominant opinion. And then he also ends with ولا يجوز بالضعيف العمل ولا به يجاب من جاء يسأل, that it is not permissible to act on a weak view, nor is it allow for you to respond to someone and give them that weaker view. You have to stick to the dominant view. I think one of the things to understand is when we're talking about the different madhahib, we're talking about the different views. One of the misunderstandings that people have is they're all correct in the sense that like you can follow whatever you want because at the end of the day they're all ijtihadi issues and they're all correct. And I think that we need to sort of clarify that misunderstanding, and we say, look, all the ijtihadi views and the different madhahib and ikhtilaf within madhahib, we say they're all on haqq. Okay, they're not batil, right? They're not like sinful, wrong or such. They're all on haqq. They're mujtahideen who have ijtihadi differences. And the Prophet also mentioned that for the one who gets it correct, you have 2 rewards, and for the one who gets it wrong, like they'll have 1 reward. Okay, but what that shows is the mujtahid can be correct or the mujtahid can be wrong. Okay? And when we say, okay, there's these different opinions between the madhahib, or there are these different opinions within the madhab, our view is that they're all on haqq, but one of them is sawab and the other is khata. Or one of them is correct and the other one is an error. They're all going to get the reward, but we know that in conflicting opinions, one will be correct and one will be incorrect. And when we establish and we say like our madhab, we believe is the one that is correct, with the possibility that it could be wrong, right? And the other madhab, the view in the other madhab is incorrect, with the possibility that it could be correct, because it's ijtihadi, it's not qat'i, it's not like clear in that sense. And likewise within the madhab, we say this is the dominant view. What we're saying is then we believe this view is the correct view, and the other one is the khata, the other one is the incorrect. If you believe one is correct and the other is incorrect, then on what logical grounds are you going to say I'm going to go with the incorrect opinion? Right? So if something is rajih and you believe that is correct, then that's the one you have to follow.
Extending the same logic, then couldn't someone say, like you mentioned, when something is rajih, but the fatwa can be given on something which is not rajih, then why is that allowed?
And this is within the scope of ijtihad, where we believe that this is sawab, right? This is, we believe, the stronger one. But because now when there are circumstances that force you to, or extenuating circumstances or such that make it difficult to follow that opinion, this is where we say that the ikhtilaf then is a rahmah, right? The ikhtilaf is a mercy. And we say this isn't outside the scope of ijtihad. And it's not when we say it's sawab and it's khata, right? We're not saying it's qata and like clearly we know this is the case. We're saying we believe that this is the one that is correct with the possibility of error, and this one is incorrect with the possibility of being correct. And that ikhtilaf, that rahmah, is what allows you to then have that room to move away. But there's usually something that is forcing you, not that you say, I'm just going to pick this one because I like it.
Basically, like you're trying to to stick completely to what your principles lead you to, but only in the case of of absolute need or something else. That's when you just take the rukhsa, like, okay, there is a chance that this could be right, and this really helps us right now, so we can give fatwa on it. Is that kind of accurate?
Yeah, and even those principles of like when you move away are also like established principles from the nas, right? So like even where those principles lead us, like we have sufficient comfort to say that inshallah this is okay, because it's based off of those principles that we left. But we moved based off those principles, not simply because we said there's another opinion, so like why not?
Right. And I was thinking, going off of your topic of basically what the process of a mufti is as they're considering different opinions and giving preference to one. Who would you say is a qualified mufti to do that? And the reason why I ask this is because we, like, for a layperson, right, that goes to his masjid and sees the imam and maybe has heard of this sheikh in town that is titled as mufti and other as sheikh and so on and so forth. We know that at least in the Indian subcontinent and in the Dars al-Nizami system, there's a process for Ifta, right? There's a course for it, and there's a certification, a graduation, and so on and so forth that happens. But then there's also lots of ulama from the Arab world, or from Turkey, from the Balkans, and so on and so forth. You have muftis there too. You have like Uzbek muftis, and you have like Russian muftis. Generally they'll have like a grand mufti or something for the town, but they have a completely different process. And then in places like Egypt and so forth, you have muftis there. As a matter of fact, even let's say nationalities that don't necessarily stick to a certain madhab, they also have like qudat, they have judges, and they also have muftis as well. So for a lay person, what is a proper mufti that they can reach out to?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the ulama and also general public, we need to have standards for whom we consider to be a mufti, right? And I think what happens is a lot of times when someone does a course, like a 2-year course, and they finish that, right? We would say, okay, they've studied the foundations, and inshallah they got really good set of training. But a person really becomes like a true mufti, like as you mentioned, like through that mulazamatul faqih, right? Like you have spent considerable amount of time under someone. Okay, not that you finished a course and you went back and then you just started giving your own fatwas and never kind of having them checked by your teacher. Okay, those 2 years don't create a mufti. 2 years create foundations. Mufti Sahab, like in his usul Iftā, like in multiple places, sort of keeps driving that point home that it has to be through prolonged time under someone. And that's why many of our ulama, like even those who graduated 10 years ago or more, like don't necessarily even just call them mufti, they'll call them like maulana, okay? Because the idea that for you to be a mufti, like that needs to happen.
Yeah, I believe this is Maulana Abdul Malik's policy, actually. Like, it's an official policy of his. He refuses to call most people that have completed Ifta as muftis. But my question was more like, there is so much variation into the study of Ifta, right? Like, you have like, I can say maybe the Dars al-Nizami has an actual codified like curriculum for it, but what I'm saying is almost the rest of the world doesn't really have like a particular course for it. There's mulazamatul faqih that happens. There's like ifta and istifta that is happening. There's even durus that are given, right? They study, rasmul mufti, they study qawaid fiqhiyya, but they might not necessarily give the title mufti, and some places might give the title mufti. But at the end of the day, my question is, for a lay person, who is the mufti for them? Like, how could they differentiate? And I know, I mean, personally, a very popular celebrity that calls himself mufti, and he specifically said in one session that I didn't do any particular study for this. It's just that my barber called me mufti, so I added that to my name. I mean, although he studied like other, I mean, it's kind of sad and almost funny as well, unfortunately. But nonetheless, it's a very famous person. But that's basically how they got the title mufti. So I mean, you find sheikh, mufti, Maulana, CD, Ustad, and you have so many titles out there. For a lay person, what should they be looking for to know that this is a mufti and this is definitely a specialist that I can ask my fiqh questions to?
I would say to make it easy, right? One is, well, I'll give you a couple of things, and then like what's sort of the perhaps even easier criterion than that. One, I mean, you have to see, has the person done like their foundation Islamic studies, right? Their Alam course equivalent, if you will, because courses vary, and we're not going to say people are qualified only if they do a certain course, right? But they've done like what is the equivalent of your Alam course, so they've studied multiple sciences.
Like, would you say a bachelor's in like some Jordanian university or Syrian, Ma'had, or like in Medina University? Would you
Yeah,
say?
I mean, whether they call them like a bachelor's, master's, Alim course, whatever, like that, it's what they've studied, right? So they've studied, they've got good foundations in like all the different ulum, and then they have studied the principles of Ifta within a madhab, and they have continued to be active in issuing fatawas in that madhab under their teacher for a prolonged period of time. Okay? Not that they did a 2-year, 1-year, 3-year course, that they have been active under their teacher for several years, right? And the other one, and perhaps if a person didn't know any of those and they just stick to this last one, it's whom the senior ulama within their town consider to be a mufti.
I think that's actually very, very helpful and very succinct, I think.
Would you consider like a necessity for there to be like you mentioned mulazamat al-faqih? So does this need kind of like a chain of faqih to faqih, like mufti to mufti? And if there's like inqita where, for example, you have a person who's just a brilliant academic and he's just really good at fiqh, but he never did mulazamat al-faqih, but he's just so brilliant and then he started giving fatawa and whatnot. So and then he has students, and then 5 generations later, they have a chain. But then there's, if you get what I'm saying, like.
But
Yeah.
just to add a caveat to that, like I do think, I mean, I've seen instances of people that like are very well aware of Islamic law and like academics that have read like many, many books. But 2 things I'll say. One is that most of them won't claim to be muftis, right? They'll say like I have expertise on these, but I'm not a mufti. Like I wouldn't give you a fatwa or anything like that. That's one thing. The second thing is that I think even if somebody at some point claimed to hold the position of a mufti because they've done a lot of self-reading and they've developed some kind of knack for it, it usually is the case that their trend will not gain that kind of traction where they have like 5 generations of students. I don't think there's any example of this.
Yeah, I mean, we have an isnad, like a sanad system in our deen, right? So whether you're talking about any sort of, whether you're talking about hadith or any other ulum, or you're talking about tasawwuf, you're talking about whatever, like for all of these things, there needs to be like a chain that connects. Otherwise, I mean, whoever wishes to say whatever they wish to say can say so, right?
That makes sense.
Another thing I wanted to ask actually is in the process of doing the work of fatwa or ifta, a person answering, I remember you mentioned there's like 2 sets of we can say answering questions that we can classify. One is the kind of quick fire answer that a person is giving over WhatsApp versus some kind of detailed response. And it seemed like what you were saying is anything that is like formally written and published should be like well researched and so forth. And I think that makes sense considering the environment that we live in. If a person looks elsewhere as a resource, like on another website or some other kind of resource, they'll usually have detailed references and like explain the reasoning behind why they're answering the way they are. What are your thoughts on let's say a public platform, whether that's a book or whether that's a website where fatawa are being given, but there are no references? Is that something that should be done? Is that something that should be avoided? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Let me answer this question, then I want to add one thing to what you started off with and what I had mentioned previous. So references are given for other ulama so that they can have peace and double check the work, if you will, right? The references aren't given for the mustafti necessarily. Like a lot of times the references are in Arabic, right? And then the person asking the fatwa doesn't even understand Arabic, right? Those references are there so that other ulama, when they come across the answer, they know here's sort of how the ruling was derived, and they can validate that. or if there's a need to correct them, they can correct it. Okay? So it's presented for them, not so much for the questioner. So the questioner, if they get their answer, they get their answer. But I would say, I guess, quality of an answer is, when the answer is well referenced. Are we going to hold people practically to do that in a WhatsApp response? No. If you're going to push out something in a formal writing, then we would say, yeah, then you do it in a particular manner. The one other thing
I want to ask about, you mentioned that it's mostly for ulama, right? And I think that makes sense because they're the ones who have access to those kind of resources. But wouldn't you say that some level of it should still be for the awam, in the sense that we live in a world of an abundance, maybe an overabundance of information, and so if they find other resources, they'll definitely let's say they find like another kind of mindset or methodology of Ifta, they will usually give references as well, and there's a perception of a lack of academic rigor if a person doesn't provide any type of references. That's one thing. The other thing also is that, for example, you have academia in which you have a journal article, and there will be a ton of references, and most likely the person reading it is unable to access those references or even understand the work that the references are doing, but nonetheless they're there because it gives some kind of credibility. So wouldn't you say there's a component also for the layperson?
Yeah, I mean, the optics of an answer that is well referenced versus one that doesn't have any references, is like, will have an impact on the one asking. If the one asking has a complete trust, right, on you, and that you give them the answer and that's sufficient, then that will suffice. Otherwise, like if they ask a question and they get an answer and it doesn't really have any references or such, then naturally the person may feel like it may not get the same level of itminan. I think there's also expectations. People aren't expecting that if they send you a WhatsApp response, because a lot of times they'll say, I've got a quick question, right? And then they're just kind of expecting that quick response, as opposed to like a paper on some contemporary issue would need to have the right references, both from the Islamic sources, then also like references from like the medical or like whatever other references, based off what the topic is. And just on that one, that's where I want to mention, like, I would say like a lot of the questions that get answered are more, not instead of two, they're more like on three levels. One is the more straightforward, fast responses. The second one is then more of like a formally written fatwa where it's researched and put out. And then you have some matters that are either like so complex or they're so mukhtalafi amongst the contemporary ulama as well, that where it would be best that not just that an individual Darul Ifta puts out their fatwa, but that a collection of muftis get together and put out a collective resolution. Right? So like the American Fiqh Academy, for example, doesn't offer a Q&A service. It's not a Darul Ifta. It is a collection of muftis from across the US who collaborate, do independent research, and then share that research, and then see like, have they come to the same conclusion on certain matters, debate where they have come to different conclusions, and then issue then a resolution on the topic so that it has a much greater strength and also kind of helps resolves where some of the ikhtilaf amongst the ulama may have been on a contemporary issue. So I would say it's those three levels, in fact, of answering.
No. One question I had is like, before I get to that question, the rajih, can there, you did mention this before, but I wanted to ask one more time to make it explicit. Can there be different groups of Hanafis who one sees this as rajih and the other sees, like, we're not talking about like an individual like Allama Anwar Shah Kashmiri maybe versus, but rather two groups, like let's say the Syrian Hanafis versus the subcontinent Hanafis versus the Turkish Hanafis, and they, these groups have come to different academic conclusions on the rajih. Is that possible, or has that happened kind of?
No, I guess what I'd say is there's a bit more complexity to the question, because even amongst the mujtahideen fuqaha, like you had ikhtilaf amongst what they felt to be the stronger opinion, the rajih opinion, right? And then you have a certain, within your usul al-Ifta, then you have principles around determining how do you resolve the ikhtilaf amongst the ulama, the fuqaha who felt this is actually rajih versus others who felt this is rajih, right? And then there's like details on like the the tabaqat of the fuqaha and like the words that were used, and there's like all these principles of determining then, okay, how do you then finally get to a conclusion of saying this was actually the rajih. Those principles of Ifta and that process doesn't change based off of like whether you're Desi, Turkish, Syrian, Jordanian, anything. Like those are just the principles. And by the time we get to us, like we're not in like those higher tabaqat of the mujtahideen where we're going to determine what is the rajih view. Right? By this time, like that work has been done. Now, what you may have though is in some contemporary issue where certain ulama have come to a different conclusion in that contemporary issue based off of like their research and such, and in some cases based off of like their urf, the challenges that they were addressing within their communities. And that's why in general the better principle is that ulama from one country don't give fatwas to ulama from a different country. Like if you get a question from like we get a question from the UK, say we've got this ikhtilaf in like Isha time, like when do we pray Isha, we say ask your local ulama. Like there's ikhtilaf there, there's circumstances there, ask them, right? Like
hinging off of that, do you think then students of Ifta should go to other countries to do Ifta, or should they do it in their own country?
I mean, ideally, we would say that while there's senior ulama in other countries, like it's good, alhamdulillah, like if the students get to benefit from them. There are certain challenges that I would say also come with that. One is, a lot of in some of these places, like they'll write their fatawa in Urdu, and what happens is then those students, when they come back, because they haven't had that practice in writing in English, will sometimes suffer from a lack of confidence in their writing skills. That's one challenge that comes when students go overseas and they're studying somewhere where they're going to write their fatawa in Urdu. The other thing then is if somebody who does want to go overseas, what they should also look for is that ensure that the teacher also has exposure to different cultures, so that the teacher can also train the student accordingly, not just based off the urf in their country, but also having that broader understanding in the urf of their home country and how to apply those properly, so that they can learn how to engage in their environment in a proper manner. Sometimes what happens is sometimes you have a student will go overseas, study, and do well, mashallah, but then when they come back, they struggle to have proper application in their own countries because just a lack of training in how to deal with some of the more specific circumstances in their home country. So you find them to be either overly strict based off of adherence to customs that are not applicable in their places, or they kind of go the other end of the the spectrum, become overly lax where that laxity wasn't required. So I think there's benefit when students go overseas, but there's certain challenges that you have to think through. How are you going to manage those challenges? Yes, I think ideally, if eventually we get to a point where you do have some of those like senior ulama, but within our own countries, then that would be best, right? Students to study here, kind of removing that international dependence and creating necessary resources in our own countries. I'll just mention, about maybe like 24 years ago, or like at least a couple decades ago, Mufti Sahab, he had come to Chicago, and I remember like his bayan, he had mentioned very specifically that he said, you all need to stop sending your kids to Deoband and create your own Deoband here. Okay? And I think it was very like just, the foresight in what he was mentioning was amazing. I mean, it's a lot.
I think that's extremely profound. I mean, it's so farsighted, to be honest, because there are contexts here and issues here that it's very important for people to stay within the country and understand better, and give fatwa based on that. So like I know, mashallah, I don't want to advertise your Darul Ifta here, but I mean personally from what I know, and I think it's a very well-known reputation as well, that it's perhaps one of the most rigorous and academically complex places for a student to do Ifta. And when people have come and asked me, where should I go do Ifta? Should I go overseas or should I do it somewhere here? Then I generally recommend some place like yours, because I feel that the point that you've mentioned, the way of the elder muftis and their supervision and training, that's one thing that's found, and also the component of understanding contemporary issues and how to address issues in the contemporary era, that aspect is also maintained. I mean, personally, I've had a conversation, I remember, with a student that had completed their Ifta in Darul Karachi. And I mean, mashallah, this person is so intelligent and very well spoken. And one thing that I noted from the conversation is there was a huge focus in their training on keeping their answers extremely concise, because as legal wording, you don't want to be wordy, because the more you say, the more implications there are. And I found that very interesting, because I know, for example, I mean, even when we look in the past in classical scholarship, you'll find really two kind of fatawa that are written. Some are rasail, right? You have like Suyuti's fatawa, which in essence is not really fatwa as in like yes or no type of question, this is permissible, this is impermissible. Rather, it's like research, or even the fatawa of Mullah Ali Qari. I mean, there are many examples of this, right? Where it's complete rasail of research, right? And then you have very concise answers as well, where you'll find the Mufti answering with one line. In Mahmudiyya, you'll find instances of this. So like one line and just a reference or something like that. So definitely we have those two categorizations. So I found that interesting. And I do think being in the context of North America, knowing the kind of audience that you're addressing, knowing how to angle the words that you're saying, I think that, and getting like years of training for that, I think that is very relevant.
Yeah, one other point I'll mention around like again, not to like promote or pitch like the Ifta where I teach, but one of the challenges that we sometimes find when the student goes overseas is when they come back, they struggle to maintain connection, and that mulazamatul faqih, get like that part 2 of their course, if you will, doesn't end up happening. Right? There's no continued working under somebody at that point. And that's something that what we have done at our Ifta is we've said everyone that studies here, we have a public list of our graduates. We publicly mention here are the people that we stand behind, basically, and all those graduates are required to come back 1 year, 5 years, and 10 years after their graduation and retake their exams. And if they don't, then we'll take their. If they don't, Allah forbid, then we will take their name off of our list. So something of that nature, where like now you're forcing them to stay connected, come back, take their exams, continue to be under supervision and such. It becomes really harder to enforce that. Where like if you had to keep traveling back to Pakistan or keep traveling to somewhere else, like obviously there's an additional level of difficulty that forms.
And I think this process that you mentioned, I mean, I hadn't heard of it before, but it's very, very interesting, because it reminds me of other professions. Like doctors are required to be, constantly up to date and, be up to date with, latest issues in their field. And I think even, I mean, yourself, you're engaged with the IT field, same thing over there, right? Like if you're 10 years behind in any subfield of the IT field, then you're likely not gonna get a job, because it's so difficult with the field that's moving at such a speed. And I think the same thing is found in Ifta as well, right? That if a person doesn't keep in touch, then one is that they're forgetting a lot of things, but not only that, the field has now evolved, right? There are new issues that are rising, right? Like this fiqh of AI now. I mean, bioethics is not something that is, especially in the Islamic world, we weren't talking about it, 20 years ago. It was a very, very small voice. I mean, even now it's a very small subfield of people that work on it. But eventually these things, they become greater issues. I know one, a friend of mine who's a alim, and he serves in Florida. His local hospital had reached out to him related to like end of care treatment and like care of patients. Like how should that be according to Islam? And I mean, he, despite his extensive training, he didn't feel qualified to, answer something like that. So definitely, I think if a person doesn't keep up with the field, then they're going to get rusty. And I think this is a genial process that you've made. And I think every other field also has it, for people to keep up with their field. And I think that's very relevant.
I had one question, Mufti Sahab. You mentioned about the importance of urf, knowing the context, because urf, it has a connection with ahkam. What would you say to, for example, we hear a lot of people in the Tajaddudi movement, right? The modernist movement, they use urf a lot. They use like maqasid al-sharia, and for example, there's like a few other things. Like, how would you say that? What is the difference between the way urf is traditionally used versus how it's used within that movement?
Yeah, I mean, Ibn Abdin rahimahullah mentioned, وَالْعُرْفُ فِي الشَّرْعِ لَهُ اعْتِبَارٌ لِذَا عَلَيْهِ الْحُكْمُ قَدْ يُدَارُ, that urf does have an implication within like Sharia rulings, and sometimes, right, not always, like sometimes the rulings are then based off of urf. I think the important thing, and this is one of the jobs of the Mufti, is understanding what rulings have an urf component to them to begin with. Because if the ruling is based off of just nas, for example, right, it's not based off of urf, then it's not something that you will just say will change with time. Okay? If a ruling was based off of urf, then you would say, okay, then if the urf is the foundation for the ruling, then you have to look at, okay, what's our urf, and look at the ruling based off of that, ensuring it's not violating some other principle of the Sharia. And then there's like different types of urf, like urf khas, and like they have different implications and such. Like there's kind of getting into more details there. But the important thing is that you have to understand where urf will make a difference and where urf doesn't make a difference. If it's become very common, let's say, for people to take interest, it will remain haram, right? If it becomes very common for people, to like, unfortunately in some like Muslim countries, right, that have unfortunately the effects of of being under the occupation of the Soviet Union and such, like you go there and like you don't find any woman like really wearing hijab and such. Okay? We won't say like, okay, we will look at the urf and say you don't have to wear hijab. Like there are rulings where urf doesn't make a difference, and then there may be rulings where urf does make a difference. So one is everything's principled, and so you have to understand how that makes a difference. And maqasid al-sharia, likewise, we say that maqasid al-sharia is something that helps us appreciate the deen. So we say that there are these maqasid in the sharia, and based off of those maqasid, here are how the rulings have been derived. And you can find that you can map these rulings to these maqasid. Okay? But the rulings aren't derived from maqasid, right? There's illah, right? There's looking at what's the cause behind a ruling, and those causes, that illah is what gives the ruling. The hikmah behind it is not what affects the ruling. The maqasid, help you appreciate the ruling, but they're not what cause. It's not the cause behind the ruling. Right?
So what if someone says? So what you're saying is that the maqasid al-sharia, this is something we understand after the fact, right? After we have already analyzed. But what if someone says, okay, it's the same thing with like qawaid al-fiqh. These are things which are mustanbat or taken from the nusus, and then we apply them to other nusus as well. So we're doing the same thing with like maqasid al-sharia. Like what if?
But I think what Mufti Sahab was drawing attention to is like the differentiation between illah and hikmah, right? From maqasid al-sharia, it's something that post facto you are analyzing, and you've realized that now this is the hikmah, this is the higher objective that sharia is trying to achieve. A qaida fiqhiyya is completely different. It's something that is derived explicitly from nusus, from text. It's not something that is being surmised as a kind of general pattern or a higher kind of objective that is trying to be achieved. So I think Mufti Sahab alluded in the differentiation between illah and hikmah, and actually a lot of people fall into this trap, which is equating illah and hikmah.
But aren't there certain qawaid that are also derived from multiple nusus?
Yeah, I think Mufti Sahab gives a really good example that I think helps understand this, right? Where he gives you like the example of the traffic light, and he says that the traffic light, you have to stop at, like when you see the red light, that's your illah, that's the cause, and the ruling that will come there is that you will stop, okay? And the wisdom there is that you don't get into an accident. And you can say, Mufti Sahab doesn't mention this part, but you can then say the government has this maqsad of ensuring safety of its citizens, okay, protecting their life, right? Like hifdhun nafs and such, okay? But you can't then make an argument that it was a red light, but there was nobody around, so then I could go through the red light, okay? because we would say, although yes, the hikmah of ensuring there's no accidents, and the maqsad of ensuring we have safety for everybody, although like you can argue that those things aren't found when there's no one at the intersection, at the end of the day we say the ruling will always still be based off of the illah, which is if it's a red light, you must stop. Okay?
Wow.
So I think that kind of helps you understand. Mufti Sahab mentions this within the aspect of illah and the hukm and the hikmah, but you can bring in the maqasid here as well and still kind of see that in that frame light where they don't create the ruling. The ruling's not based off of them, but you can appreciate the ruling within its broader goals still.
I think also, inshallah, we look forward to in the future having a longer session about ikhtilaf and the different variations of fatawa that are given, the kind of principles or misuse of principles, misuse of maqasid that have been applied in the last couple of centuries. And I think a lot of that has to do with coloniality and issues of identity without people realizing. There's a long history. Actually, an entire study of colonization can be done just through the lens of fatwa, like how, because subhanAllah, our ummah is very unique in the sense that fatawa literally, even though it's theory, it creates normativity, it creates action, right? It will literally shape the action of people. And the weaponization of that by colonial powers or people that work with colonial powers, there are direct lines in recent history that have shown trends of fatwa changing in certain regions because of colonial powers or the influence of colonial powers. I think that would be a much more interesting discussion, inshallah, that we can have. We know Mufti Sahab has to go, but there's an entire session, inshallah, that we can do on ikhtilaf and what to do in instances of ikhtilaf. Can somebody pray behind somebody that is not of their madhab, and so on and so forth. I think you'll have beautiful insights to give us, inshallah. Jazakumullahu khairan for your time. I don't know if Musab has anything to add. And Mufti Sahab, any last words?
I did want to ask actually one last question related to the same topic, actually. And sorry to take it back a little bit, and I'll just end on this. But, when you have, for example, you have a one context, let's say you keep all the variables the same, right? All the variables are the same. So the Mufta Bihi opinion should come out the same. Is it possible from one mufti to another, with him being the only variable, you could have a different, fatwa? Like with the mustafti is the same, the urf, everything is the same. The haja, all those variables are the same. The only differing variable is the mufti himself.
I mean, we say, look, at the end of the day, the mufti is a human, and the mufti has the capacity to make an error. So if you say everything's the exact same, and then let's say somebody got a fatwa from two different places.
Yes.
Either the understanding varied, because let's say you can take the same question, send it to a mufti in the US and send it to a mufti in South Africa. Okay, but because their urf is different and their circumstances are different, you can get a different answer, even though the question paper maybe still be the same.
That's
yeah. Or I mean, if you say what if I send it to you send it to me and other person in the same city, yes, or such. I mean, we say, look, at the end of the day, no one is safe from mistake, and that can also happen, right?
But that's actually you actually got my question. Does that necessitate one of them made a mistake? Because technically they're following the same usul and all the variables are the same. The only difference is the mufti. So if you have two different answers, that necessarily means one made a mistake in the process and the other didn't, or possibly both of them did.
I mean, I think this kind of gets you into the topic that we're saying, maybe it could be a thing, which is can you have ikhtilaf amongst ulama, right? So not we're no longer talking about differences in the madhab, views within the madhab or within the madhāhib. You're talking about now ikhtilaf at the individual mufti level. Can you have ikhtilafat, and what ikhtilafat are considered to be valid versus when we would say that no, one of them is actually this ikhtilaf isn't valid, this is wrong and unacceptable.
I think there are a few other parameters too, right? For example, one person accepting one tarjih versus another person accepting a different tarjih. Like that could be a component as well. And also like maybe someone not deeming something as darura versus someone else deeming it as darura, or someone not deeming it as haja versus someone else deeming it as haja. I think there could be these small variations as well.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think that kind of goes into the urf type of thing, where like if a mufti's exposure to certain challenges can create like laxity, like they may, and I would say like somebody who has, for example, been more involved in the community for a longer period of time, see certain challenges, may understand a certain haraj within a ruling, versus somebody who hasn't had that exposure and may not necessarily agree that there is a haraj. But I mean, I guess at the end of the day, like it depends on like what your question is. There could be different reasons why someone can actually come to a different ruling based off of like even just how they understood the question. Mufti Sahab also mentioned, like the first ijtihad is in just understanding the question and like knowing like what are the proper components to look into. But if it can it be that someone says, hey, we both, I guess, yeah, the ikhtilaf you're going to have is somebody say, we don't think this is a haraj, or we think this is a haraj, or we think that in this case, like this isn't violating the principles and such. There can be certain ikhtilafat that you can have, but then now we're kind of getting to
one example, like to make it more concrete, and
yeah.
one we can get into this more inshallah in the next session we have. But for example, the beard, right? This is not something really which relies on urf or like that too much. But for example, some people will say, okay, if you ask like a Syrian Hanafi, or if you ask like some not versus if you ask some other Hanafis, right, that like in the subcontinent, they may give you different answers, and like all the variables are the same. The only difference is the mustafti. So that could be one example, maybe.
Yeah,
like
I think Hafiz Musab gave us like the perfect cliffhanger, to dive into the next session, a longer session where we'll talk about exactly that, inshallah.
So,
you have any final words?
Yeah, I'll just mention on that one though that the example there isn't a difference in the mustafti. There's a pretty big difference in the variable there, which is there's a difference in whom you're asking, right? So if you're saying you're asking ulama from certain regions versus certain region, which is I think different than like the initial question.
They're living in the same area, but they're from two traditions. That's what I mean.
Okay, got it. I see what you mean. Like they're both here. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. But
inshallah, we can get into that next time.
Inshallah.
To be continued, inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan, Mufti Abrar. Do you have any final advice for students of knowledge, or even non-students of knowledge before we wrap it up?
No, I mean, I would just say that this, like, when we start talking about like fatawa and differences and like and such, we spent maybe like more than an hour 15, an hour 20, to kind of discuss this, and there's just so much that you can have like a series of these discussions. I think what's worthwhile to people to realize is it's a very rich field. It's a very detailed field. There's a lot that goes into it, and I guess there was a conference recently here in Chicago. Masjid Darul had organized one around like AI, right? And one of the talks that I gave within that was on AI fatwas and how AI can it be used in fatawa, right? And I won't kind of open up that can here, but as part of that discussion, like I talked about like what does a mufti consider as they're thinking about like what the ruling in the fatwa is, right? And one of the things that I realized afterward, because I got direct feedback from a lot of people, is they said like we never realized that there was so much that actually goes into it, right? And I think maybe that's the advice that I would just kind of end with, is that people just kind of recognize that the field of fatawa and fatawa writing and such, there's a lot that goes into it, right? People think of things as like, you already studied, so you already know everything. Here, let me ask you a quick question, right? People don't realize that their quick question like took somebody like 6 hours of like their own volunteer time to like research and then give them like a 2-sentence answer. right? Like a 2-sentence answer takes like a minute to type, but they don't necessarily see what went behind it. I think the advice I would just give people is that there's a lot of depth within the topic. There's a lot of nuances. It's very detailed, and kind of appreciate what you don't know, and then try to learn about what you don't know, right? But the first step is just appreciate and recognize it and say, hey, there's this whole thing that maybe I don't fully understand. And if they're telling me, hey, like you have to follow the dominant view, or you have to follow madhab, or like this is the view, and so on, I'll make an effort to learn the why, but let me just first recognize that, yeah, I don't know at this moment, and let me at least kind of take what they're saying, and then let me learn more. I think sometimes when people don't recognize the depth in something, they don't appreciate it, don't give it value, and then don't accept it. And I think maybe that's kind of where I would just leave it and say, just recognize that there's a lot here, and you can appreciate it, make an effort to learn. Hopefully, inshallah, Project Ihya will do more of these sessions with other ulama as well, and like this will be a forum to learn, inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan for having me. It was, I enjoyed the discussion, and I ask Allah to put barakah in this effort that you're all making, and that Allah makes a lot of people benefit through your sessions.
I mean, Jazakumullah khairan. It was our pleasure to host you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.